economies are incredibly dependent on cheap energy.
No, it's a good opportunity.
Developing countries look at our lifestyle and they want the same prosperity that we have. China and India particularly are on a fast track to getting that. But 1.4 billion people in the world tonight don't have access to electricity. Oh, right. Thank you. Now I'm definitely on. I'm hearing it. Great. 1.4 billion people in the world tonight don't have access to electricity. Is this still okay? You all right? Another 3 billion people tonight will be relying on wood, charcoal and dung for heat and lighting. Electricity is the great economic enabler. To get it, these people in developing countries need access to energy as cheaply as we've had it. Today, that energy mostly comes from fossil fuels, conventional oil, gas and coal, which are becoming increasingly expensive to find and develop, taking them even further out of the reach of developing nations. And the costs are not just economic. From a purely selfish perspective, as Australia's demand for energy continues to escalate, we also need to be looking for alternatives. We are self-sufficient in electricity, largely through coal and gas, but not self-sufficient in oil. When oil prices rise, we feel the ripples everywhere, from the petrol pump to the cost of a loaf of bread. We're also aware, though, that our reliance on burning coal, particularly, comes at a very heavy environmental price. Tonight, we're going to make a nod right up front to the option of renewables, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight. There are huge opportunities, but also enormous challenges in replacing our domestic consumption with renewables, and that's why we're having a full forum just on renewables here in this room on the 18th of October. Realistically, we're a generation away from renewables being available in sufficient volumes to replace conventional fuels. The Beyond Zero Emissions report indicates an investment of $37 billion a year every year for 10 years to drive Australia into a renewable future. So renewables are one answer, but for the time being at least, they are not the only answer. What will we do in the meantime for both domestic and export demand? There's another really important aspect of this energy question, which is about our behaviour as consumers, whether we're individual or business consumers. And again, we'll be having a full forum about that on the 6th of December, and so we'll touch on it tonight, but probably not spend a lot of time on it. So there are environmental, economic, social and ethical questions attached to the decisions that we make, not just for ourselves, but for other countries that depend on us. If we don't come up with new energy resources, how will we live? How will we work? How will we transport ourselves and the things that we need? How will we feed ourselves and the 40 million other people in the world that we feed? And how will we continue to operate industries such as tourism and manufacturing, on which our economy is also reliant? Taking a global view of the world and how its resources are distributed, what are our rights and our obligations in supplying developing countries with what they need and what we have in plenty? But how do we balance these development needs with our global environmental responsibility? A wicked problem. Politically, certainly, but also personally, a wicked problem. Now, we're not naive enough to think that we're going to solve this problem in 90 minutes tonight. But we do think that this community, our state community, our country, is or ought to be smart enough to find ways to have the lifestyle that we want, including the prosperity and the jobs, and to protect and enhance the environment at the same time. Enough of the preaching. Let me introduce to you, briefly, Mr. Wally White. Wally represents the Australian Association for the Study of Peak Oil. You can find his bio on tonight's program, as you can the bios of all of our panellists tonight. While we have varying estimates of when the world's consumption of oil is going to outstrip its production, and the International Energy Agency is now saying that that's already happened in 2006, Wally, can you tell us, what does peak oil actually mean for us here in the room tonight?
Well, peak oil as a concept is the time when our production of oil maximises, and from this point onwards we'll produce less and less oil. It is quite right that oil did peak by 2006 if we're talking about what we describe as conventional fractions of oil. We are able to produce more oil than we did in November of 2005 by using unconventional sources and by substitutes for oil. What oil means to us, or what the vulnerability to oil depletion means to us is that we're likely to face three kinds of events. One of the events is a sharp and sudden decrease. If, for instance, one of the suppliers, like Saudi Arabia, has an uprising, and that's not totally out of the question, that could disrupt supplies, and we could find ourselves with a diminution of availability of fuels. We could also have a great variability in the supply-demand balance, and associated with fluctuations in the economy, which means a wild variation in prices. And that's what we've been experiencing over the last few years. The other event is just the gradual diminution of supply that comes as the search for the renewables and the alternatives are unable to meet the growing demands of the emerging economies like China and India. So we're faced with those. What it's going to mean to us is that we are going to be disadvantaged, particularly those of us who are highly dependent on oil for our transport. And in Australia, 72% of our oil consumption is on transport, and 90% of our transport is dependent on oil. So those of us that live in the fringe areas will find it more and more difficult to be able to afford to travel to work. We saw a parallel of that in the United States, where in the global financial crisis, people weren't able to drive their large pickup trucks to work, so they lost their jobs, so they couldn't pay their mortgages, and whole suburbs were abandoned. I think that Australia will be in a better position than that, but it is something that we will have to use land use tactics and other means to make ourselves less dependent and to give ourselves the resilience to respond to the vulnerability.
Okay. Wally, there was actually, I think what you're saying is that there was some suggestion that in fact the global financial crisis was perhaps partially triggered at least by peak oil. And that was responsible partially for the mortgage crisis in some, US suburbs and cities.
Certainly partially. It wasn't the only factor, but it certainly was one of the contributors.
Okay. And so you've talked a little bit about the fact that we need to make some changes in terms of our usage patterns. Where are the big opportunities that you see for us in Australia, or particularly in Queensland, I guess, for where we might be able to substitute some alternatives, either in terms of unconventional resources or in terms of industry changes?
Well, I think the biggest gains that we're going to have are in the personal transport areas, because it's the personal transport areas where we waste the most energy that we derive from oil. It's our private cars. And so what we need to do is to change our planning arrangements so that we access more of our goods and services more locally, so that we don't have to travel so far to get our goods and services or to work. If we're obtaining our goods and services more locally, that will stimulate the enterprise locally that will then give us jobs locally. So that's a different pattern. We'll have to put more of our investment into group transport, public transport, and active transport, cycling and walking, which will go hand in hand with the clustering and the localization of enterprise. So there's quite a number of things that we're trying to do for other reasons, and I treat oil vulnerability as one of our urban design tools for better placemaking.
I could see that will work for some industries. I'm wondering about the role of manufacturing, for example, as an industry, and we've already seen this week with BlueScope Steel some quite major disruption in that industry. I'm wondering about what potential you see for those kinds of industries where it's really not going to be, I think, the circumstance where you can localise production in that way.
Yeah. I think in those instances, I think that we will see a trend away from dependence on oil for a lot of those kinds of things. Steel industry, for instance, is highly dependent on coal for their major energy source. Part of the issues that we have is that the extraction of coal is highly dependent on oil. But I think we'll see motive power in mining and so on trending away from the use of oil, and that the mining equipment and so on will progressively be using either gas or electricity in those processes.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on, can I just get our sound guys? I've got a whole lot of feedback of noises that I think is annoying some of the people here in the corner too. I'm just not sure where it's coming from. I just seem to be hearing other voices all the time, and yeah.
What are they telling you to do?
Oh, boom, boom.
Sounds like it's like
Run. So I'm just not sure where that's coming from, but we'll see if we can get it sorted. Thanks. Can we move on then? Move the conversation on. Wally, you talked about unconventional sources of oil. I want to move the conversation to Liam Tobin of QER, one of Queensland's resources companies. Now, QER is investing in exploration and technology development for shale oil. And a decade ago, the Stewart Oil Shale project near Gladstone was shelved for economic and environmental reasons, and we've not heard much about shale oil in Queensland since then. So it would be great to, to understand where shale oil is up to. So, Liam, can I get you to tell us a little bit about it? What is it? Where is it? How are you getting to it?
Before I go to that, can I pick up a bit about
Please do.
Peak oil? And I guess we'd make a distinction between transport fuels and stationary energy, so coal and gas and so forth could be seen on the stationary side, and obviously gas can make that leap over into transport fuels as a liquid as well. And the point that Wally made about 72% of our transport being road transport, and that, that's what puts food on in our supermarkets and so forth, and we are absolutely dependent on that. So that's a huge factor for us in Australia particularly. With regards to the peak oil, I know that there's a widespread of opinion, and you go from the IEA 2006, they say peak oil, and you can stretch it out from there. And certainly we see there are new finds of oil, but increasingly they are getting more difficult to get to, or they take more processing to be able to use, and they come with other issues as well. The point I'd make, though, is in Australia we see it already. In 2000 we were self-sufficient in oil use, and in the last decade we've dropped to about half of our oil self-sufficiency. So that's a really big factor. That's a big issue for us from an economics point of view, with a balance of payments and so forth. And it's slated or predicted, and these are figures that come from federal bureaus and agencies and the consultants reporting into the federal government, but they're predicting about 18%. So I'm not sure whether to look at you or look at maybe I'll look at the audience and do it that way. So by 2030, we're looking at 18% self-sufficiency in oil. So that's a very big drop, and that whole fuel security issue starts to become quite significant. I'm not sure if people are aware, but this year we saw China shut off, for example, the diesel exports out of China to be able to protect its own resources. Well, if we're relying on 80% of our fuel coming from offshore, then we're very much into that sort of realm where we're relying on others and the whims or the decisions of other governments, particularly national oil companies and so forth. So they're real factors for us to be concerned about. The other point I'd make about oil is, and I'll put my ex-refinery manager hat on here, and that is, and I'll invoke the previous title, which was Oils Ain't Oils, and they aren't. There is a very wide range in terms of the quality and the types of oils. So you go from, in Australia, most of our refineries would refine what they call light, sweet crudes, which are very low in sulphur and low in terms of specific gravity, to very heavy, sour crudes, which typically the Middle East crudes would be. And most of the Australian refineries would not be able to refine those and create fuel products out of that. So it's not just that oil is being found. Is it the right sort of oil for those production facilities and to be able to put fuel into those markets? So there's some distinctions there.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I bring you back then to
Yeah,
shale
sorry.
oil? And let's have a chat about what that is and where it is and what you're working with.
Yeah. So, again, and this is probably a personal story in this, part of my move to Queensland Energy Resources from Caltex was very much driven about the future supply and my views of where that was going. I was trying to run a refinery where we were struggling to find oil to supply into the refinery, and I'll just use one other stat and then I will go on to shale. And that is Lytton, which is the Caltex refinery at the mouth of the river. Over the next 5 years, it would account to run that one refinery for about 80 to 100% of the available crude in the Asia-Pacific region, that one refinery. And that's not sustainable. It's got to do other things to keep going. So that leads me to shale oil. Shale oil is algae that's been laid down in sediments in a sea or a lake environment. It's a typical hydrocarbon in many respects. It just hasn't gone through some of the final processes of heat and pressure. So what we would do with it is we mine it in a traditional fashion and put it through a vertical vessel where we heat it, and we heat it to a temperature where it will send off the oil as a vapour, collect that, and then we can process that in a normal refinery sort of a way. Queensland has about 92% of Australia's shale oil, mostly located around the central Queensland region. So from Gladstone up to north of Mackay and inland through to places like Jaringa and so forth. And there's about shale oil that we know about and we think is recoverable. There's about 22 billion barrels of oil. And to put that in perspective, that's about 4 or 5 times the original inventory of Bass Strait. So we've got that declining, but here's a very significant resource. There is other stuff at depth that we know about, but we're not sure how you'd get to that. And you probably wouldn't get all of that 22 billion barrels, but it's a very, very significant resource. Okay,
and Liam, how close are you to tapping the resource? What's involved with that?
Yeah, okay. We're doing a few things. I should point out we've been doing this since about 2004. You mentioned Southern Pacific Petroleum. QER bought or took over their assets. But in the meantime, we tested their original facility. We decided that wasn't an appropriate technology. It couldn't meet what we thought were the requirements that our society would expect of it. We have a sister company in the US where we took 10,000 tonne of shale oil from Australia and put it through the same process in Colorado, and then we produced diesel and jet from that. So we know that the shale will go through this process and that it works and works in a very sustainable way, and it's economic and it will perform environmentally. The other thing that we've been doing is we've been building a demonstration facility near Gladstone, about 15 kilometres north of Gladstone. That's about a $100 million facility. It's about as small as we thought we could build to demonstrate effectively to the community and the government that technology works and that it is also environmentally sound. But obviously that's a very significant... It will never make any money. It'll cost us a lot of money to run it. But its sole purpose is to prove to the community and to the government that this process is technically and environmentally capable and sound. So that's what we've been up to. In the meantime, we've been working with the community in the Gladstone region particularly, but also in a wider field. And Gladstone really would be the only community in Australia that has had any recent experience with oil shale. And we find that with the work that we've done, we've taken people from that community to see the Colorado facility. We've taken members of the Queensland government from Durham, from the federal government, from Geoscience and Juha and so forth to the Colorado facility. And the next bit for us is really to show people. We've built it's an odd sort of facility. It's very much a demonstration plant with a lot of visitor sort of access and explanation, as opposed to a traditional industrial facility, but it's about showing people and getting them to understand how the process works.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. The original project, I understand, was shut down because it was economically unviable, but also that there were concerns about impact on the Great Barrier Reef, for example, and some other environmental issues. What kinds of concerns are you discussing with the Gladstone community at the moment, and what sorts of things are you aware of that your communities might be concerned about?
Well, I should also point out, at the time that SPP was running that facility, I happened to be the Associate Dean of Engineering at Central Queensland University, and I mediated, it seems an interesting leap from there to here, but mediated the community with the company concerned. So I do understand the original community concerns, and they were very much based around odour, noise and dust. The process we're talking about is completely different. I could put them at different ends of the spectrum. Ours is a sealed process. It works with lump. The temperatures that we use are much lower. The environmental emissions control and things like that are a world apart from what was there previously. And that's what we hope to demonstrate. But so we understand where the community was, and they were very concerned about that. And certainly there was visible smoke and so forth. Having run this facility in the US, and that we're confident about what our process will do. We know it's sealed. That if for example, we stop the power to it, it will just sit there. Now, one of the issues that the previous plant had was its only option was to dump it to the ground. 500 tonne of very hot shale material with hydrocarbon coming off it. Right. You can't leave that in a horizontal kiln and so forth. We don't have those sorts of issues. We have a very simple, reliable, robust technology.
Okay.
Yeah.
We might come back to that after we've moved on a little bit further. Thanks, Liam. Let's move on to CSG. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that CSG is a new industry in Queensland. Certainly over the last few months, it's become a very hot topic of discussion in this state. If you have natural gas connected to your home at the moment, though, chances are you're already using CSG every day. It accounts for around 90% of Queensland's gas supply. Now, the CSG industry says that after 15 years of safe and efficient CSG extraction in Queensland, we have no reason to fear the rapid expansion of the industry to supply export markets. Around $45 billion worth of CSG projects are on the slate for Queensland, bringing some 18,000 jobs to regional areas in desperate need of employment opportunities, and adding around $1 billion each year in taxes to the state's coffers for infrastructure and essential services. Those are some compelling economic numbers. On the environmental side of the ledger, Australian studies by CSIRO and Worley Parsons indicate that CSG-fired power stations emit up to 70% less greenhouse gases than our existing coal-fired power stations. But in both Australia and the US, where our next speaker is based, CSG has raised significant environmental and health concerns related to contamination of water and fugitive emissions and the environmental and health impacts of those. In Queensland, it's also at the heart of a looming stoush over property rights. If I could welcome Professor Michael Economides, leaving aside the property rights for the moment, Professor.
I'll take that one.
He'll take that, okay. Yeah. Look,
could I just ask you, what's your understanding of the concerns being expressed in Queensland about the environmental impacts of CSG?
Well, fear is a motivating force, okay, everywhere. And let me just preface this, because with this lighting over here and the previous speakers here, I'm getting into a catatonic state. Relax, okay? If I were to tell you the end is near, is coming, you guys get impressed. If I tell you the middle is near, relax. You don't get impressed, and I don't sell as many books, okay? That's the problem. So let's talk about some of these concerns. 140,000 fracturing jobs in the United States last year. Not a single contamination of any drinking water. I would imagine case closed. 1.2 million frac jobs in the history of hydraulic fracturing in the United States. The New York Times, after 5 exposés, very attacking exposés, has perhaps found one case in 1984 that might have been some contamination, and that has been discredited, suggested is coming from a defective casing. So the issue of production from what we call coal bed methane, and you call, what do you call it here?
Coal seam gas.
Coal seam gas. It's a proven technology. It is not to be afraid of, and it has proven itself beyond any doubt that it can be done very nicely. Thank you. Now, if people in this room are here to debate and if your motives are to debate a future of hydrocarbons, I have some news for you. The world is going to be dominated by hydrocarbons for the entire 21st century. In other words, I have this vision that by the year 2100, a great-grandson of mine is going to be in front of an audience suggesting that 87% of the world energy demand still comes from oil, gas, and coal. Sunshine is free. Solar energy is bloody expensive. And it's not going to happen without government subsidies. Now let me ask you a rhetorical question. Does anybody in this room believe that there would be economically extractable hydrocarbons in this world that would not be produced because we pass legislation in Washington, D.C. or Canberra? I suggest to you it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. It will be produced. I've been working in China for the last 30 years. I'm the senior advisor to 2 major Chinese companies. And I can tell you that the Chinese are not going to play along. Last year, China spent $200 billion buying oil and gas properties all over the world, while we are contemplating our navals and we are discussing climate change. There has never been a bigger transfer, a faster transfer of power, because energy means power in the world, than what we are witnessing right now without any war. The Chinese thank us quite a bit because of our apathy towards energy sources. Energy is not something to debate in a town meeting like this in such a nonchalant fashion. The entire lifestyle that we live. Now, if any one of you here thinks that we should abrogate the lifestyle that we live for some other Kaganimi idea of going back to the 19th century romantic attitude where we actually cook our own food and we live in forests and dress in animal skins, that's a different issue. I'll not have a debate with you.
Professor, I don't think anybody actually is suggesting that, and I want to move you on a little
Well, no, but I mean, listen, I have to tell you this. I have done 50 of these presentations throughout the United States. And implicitly, people want to come and discuss about the environmental issues of fracturing, which they are nothing, they don't exist. It's a figment of people's imagination, okay? Whereas their motive is, in fact, the fact that they hate fossil fuels, okay? So I would like people to fess up, in other words, before we start any debate, what are the motives of people that are bringing up environmental issues with hydraulic fracturing? They do not exist, okay?
I think, okay, I'm going to come in and act as a bit of a devil's advocate, I think, because part of the issue that I'm picking up in the Queensland community, and there'll be others here to talk about it, is a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge, which relates then into a lack of
I strongly suggest that people that are really interested, I have written 12 books on hydraulic fracturing, okay? All of my books are used by anybody in the world. I have worked in 70 countries. Every university in the United States and the world is using my textbooks on hydraulic fracturing. I have several books at the level that are not advanced graduate diploma, okay? So please, read something before we debate, okay?
Well, can I ask you a couple of questions?
Please do.
Yeah, please. Some people claim that that fracking can contaminate groundwater.
This is nonsense. I mean, total nonsense. We cannot debate at an issue that has never happened.
It has in Australia.
Where?
There's actually a case being undertaken right now just outside
Wait a
Dalby.
minute, through casing or because of fracturing?
Through a frack that was done straight into
How?
an aquifer.
How?
Through a frack that was done straight into an aquifer.
Okay, let me ask you this. Have you modeled fracture height migration from fracturing to the drinking water aquifer? Have you done that?
The frack went straight into the drinking aquifer that was providing the stock and domestic water on
It
that
is
site.
absolutely, totally wrong. There is just no way that could happen. There is a physical impossibility for something to happen. You know why? Because if it is shallow enough, the fracture would be horizontal and not vertical. So there is no way that the fracture can actually penetrate a drinking water aquifer.
It is if you set the frack at the wrong height.
How can you do that?
That's the legal case that's being
Okay,
challenged.
we're not going to resolve
I mean,
this
it's
one
just-
tonight. We're going to move it along
No.
because part of the issue is going
Come
to be
on.
a technological
This
understanding,
is,
I think.
but this gentleman here, whom I don't know, look, I have modeled fracture height migration. I have produced 20 PhDs on the subject, and I'm telling you, we have never had a case where that thing could actually communicate vertically because the stress field is such that the maximum stress at that case will no longer be the vertical, and the fracture will become horizontal. It's a diabolical coincidence that what you're suggesting simply cannot happen. There is no law of physics that would allow fracture to penetrate drinking water aquifers. You just can't.
Okay.
Try.
Professor, can you talk to me about fugitive emissions, please, and what you see some of the issues being around that? Fugitive emissions?
I don't know what that means. What word is that?
Gas that's escaping from wells that have been drilled and therefore possibly contaminates either the air or the water.
I have never heard of that.
Okay. Not something that you've ever come across in the States?
No, I mean, if you're talking about, are you talking about faulty casing? Are you talking about problems with the well itself? Faulty casing, bad cement jobs?
Well, potentially.
It can happen, yes, that can happen, but that has nothing to do with fracturing that we're discussing.
Okay. Can you talk to us about what you've observed that the Queensland industry is doing to manage the risks? Now, you've suggested that technologically there actually isn't a risk in terms of fracturing as a technique. Are there things that the Queensland industry is doing here that you've observed are different or better from what you're doing in the US?
Look, you are way behind still in terms of technology here. It's done by the service companies. If you look at the numbers, okay, you take the activity that you have in Queensland, you would have an order of magnitude more fracturing treatments in a similar environment in Canada or the United States, okay? I would say more than perhaps 100 times, 2 orders of magnitude more. Look at Western Australia, for example. You have 1 frac spread. In Queensland, I think you have 4 frac spreads altogether. In just South Texas, you are looking at 100 frac spreads. Frac spreads is the unit, the fracs. So think of it that your activity is 1/25th of something that you would find in South Texas. Okay, so you are behind. Now, as far as the young guys that I have met here, working for Santos and companies like this, they are new, they are inexperienced. They hired a few experts from outside. There is a couple of great guys here from other countries. So they are trying. The service companies are the same, but of course they are not as well equipped as they would be in our side of the woods. Okay, so it's something that is done. Personally, as I mentioned to you before, I have worked in something like 70 countries. Before I was a professor, I've done 2,000 frac jobs myself in my career. So everywhere in the world. And I've never had some of the problems that the mythology that I often see in newspapers, like contaminating drinking water aquifers, which is preposterous, by the way, or something like that. It's just not going to happen. Okay.
Can you talk to me about the regulatory environment in the US?
Sure.
From what you've observed, do you think that the Queensland government and the industry here have got a handle on
I think
regulation of the industry?
I think so. From what I have heard, and I spoke with people. I did spoke to some of the regulators the last time I was here because I'm an advisor to both the EPA in the United States and the Texas Railroad Commission, who regulates all petroleum activities in Texas. The Railroad Commission is the regulator in Texas, okay, and also the EPA. I testified in front of the U.S. Congress several times on this. So I see some of the regulatory body issues that we have in the U.S. already coming here with a lot of non-governmental involvement, a lot more, okay? You pride to be environmentalist in this country, which I endorse. I'm an environmentalist myself, believe it or not. I own an environmental company, so we're very interested in environmental stewardship for sure. And the Railroad Commission in Texas is the sterling, I think, standard on regulations. We are not going to allow, for instance, leaky casing. I mean, it's going to be a hell of a fine if we catch somebody doing that, like what you were addressing before. So all of these things we are discussing right now have already been done ad infinitum and ad nauseum for decades. Okay, so we're not going to reinvent hydraulic fracturing in Queensland, Australia, after 60 years of experience.
And yet you still do have, don't you, the same kinds of controversy and pushback going in the US, even after 60 years, you've still got people that are
Well, of
not
course,
convinced.
and you get people I mean, look, the United States is a free country. Australia is a free country. You have people getting up and saying everything. Sorry, and say everything. Okay, so people do documentaries like Gasland, which is a despicable lie. The whole idea of this documentary called Gasland. Okay, I don't know if you've seen it. You know, it's just physically impossible for something like this to happen. But it almost got an Oscar. Okay, because people like this kind of controversy. You see what I mean? We like to, I mean, we have it inside us is the hubris against gods. Okay, and being of Greek background, I understand the word hubris. Okay, for sure. Okay, this is part of all of this argument. And I'm telling you, much of the debate in the eastern part of the United States, under the Marcellus Shale, is from people that had this fantasy that the United States, especially under the Obama administration, by the way, I'm a Democrat, you wouldn't even believe that, you know, but I voted for this guy. But you see, under the Obama administration, we're going to go full throttle towards alternatives. Mm-hmm. Yes. So imagine in this country, in this environment, suddenly you have shale gas that grows from 0 to 25% of the natural gas supply in the United States in 5 years. There has never been a story like this in the history of the oil and gas business. This brought out of the woodwork every 60s hippie who just put a necktie on right now and pretends to be a legitimate politico to go out and demonstrate against the energy industry. Okay.
I'm going to move us on, Professor, and I'm sure we will come back to you. Australian farmers feed around 60 million people each day, 40 million of them overseas, and Queensland is responsible for around 20% of that production. Queensland farmers are operating already in areas where gas is plentiful, and so they are worried about their livelihoods and their lifestyles being at risk. It's just one more concern weighing down an industry already challenged by climate change, soil degradation, labour shortages and declining productivity. And considering that agriculture accounts for fully half of Australia's water use, you can understand their concerns about potential new threats to diminishing water supplies. Drew Wagner is the Policy Director for agri-political lobby group, AgForce. And Drew, I'd like to ask you what your farmers' principal concerns are in relation to mining.
In relation to mining or in relation to CSG particularly?
Well, let's start with mining and focus down on CSG if you want to.
The biggest issue that we have, ladies and gentlemen, is one of balance and sustainability. This is not about one industry removing the other from the landscape. This is about both being in place to do what they do. Now, the reality, as Karen has just said, is that our consumption domestically in Australia of our fresh food and produce is 96% of our fresh food and produce is grown domestically. We still export a hell of a lot of that, but 96% is consumed here. Now, we are constantly facing landscape competition issues. We've got the climate change issues, we've got droughts, floods, or everything else. And trust me, we've all experienced all of that in about the last 12 or 15 months. But the reality of landscape competition means if we remove the agricultural or food and fibre production system from this landscape and replace it with 100 coal seam gas wells, or replace it with an open cut coal mine, or replace it with a bauxite extraction process, then the production system that was there and in situ and has been there sustainably for generations to date, sustainably producing, sustainably looking after the environment that's there, will not be there anymore. Now, there are some industries that it will be able to come back from, but particularly mining, we will never have an agricultural production system again on that landscape. We currently manage, as agricultural producers, some 86% of the available landscape of Queensland. That's everything that's outside of the city, 86%. 82% of the state of Queensland is currently covered by one or more mining and resource tenures.
So, Drew, what's actually changed in terms of farmers' legal rights as a result of the rush now to export for CSG, for example? What's actually changed?
The unfortunate reality, Karen, was that we've got the situation in Queensland where the referee of this game is also one of the sole largest beneficiaries. You spoke earlier of the $1 billion of royalties that's going to be paid back to the state coffers, and yet they are the ones setting the rules. Now, the reality some 12 months ago of how myself as a primary producer sitting on my family property, because we have 155,000 farm businesses across Australia, and nearly all but about 2 or 3% of them are still family owned. So it's mum and dad sitting around their kitchen table on a morning, get the knock on the door, "G'day, I'm from such and such CAS company. By the way, here's my tenure over your freehold land, but here's my tenure. And would you mind stepping out of the way, please, sir, if you were lucky, because I have the drill rigs at the front gate." That was their reality. Now, so just moving on, some of those rules have changed. Some of the conduct that these companies must adhere to has changed since October last year, and some of the realities for the exploration processes have been changed to try and gain some more of that balance there. But the process at the end of the day does not provide for a landholder to say, "I've invested $10 million into this property. It's been in my family for 5 generations now, and I've got my son and my grandkids already here that I want to pass it on to." I can't say no, because that company does have the legal right to come on.
And they have done from the beginning.
And they have done from the beginning. The only thing that's really changed is the ability for us to attempt to negotiate some more conduct arrangements. There has been some compensation provisions, and this is literally just at the exploration phase. This isn't moving forward to production. But Ag Forces, a lobby group, decided if we were going to influence that process, we needed to start at the beginning. The beginning is obviously that exploration phase. Now, the reality of exploration for coal or minerals, about 1 in 20 coal exploration will probably turn into some sort of extraction. The minerals areas will sell you, because of the variations of minerals, probably about 1 in 100. For coal seam gas, once that exploration well has been put down, the only difference between that and a production well is the headworks on that well. So the reality is that every single well that goes down can turn into, if the resource has been proven, a production well. We currently have 3,500 wells. So between 3,500 and 4,000 wells in Queensland, ladies and gentlemen. We're proposed to move to 40,000 in the next single-digit number of years.
I heard some disagreement from you earlier when you talked about the fact that that you would never be able to have a compatible agricultural and mining sector sitting alongside each other. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
I don't think we'll never be able to have. I think it's one about balance and sustainability. Just as strong as the energy debate is, the food security debate is just as simple and as strong as well. If we do not have the landscape available to us to provide for those production systems, we do not have the landscape available to us to feed the world's population.
And so, Drew, can you tell me the wells that you're talking about on properties, how they're disruptive to the operations? That's what you're suggesting, that it's actually incompatible to have CSG wells on an agricultural property? Is that what you're telling me?
There's a number of issues here, Karen. The first issue is, I'll go back, I'll start at the beginning and work the way through the process. The first issue is that we have a Queensland government where we had a previous resource minister quoted to say that the Queensland government is doing what someone in the automobile industry did for the very first time and taking the car out of the garage to see what impact it had on society. The Queensland government is doing that with the coal seam gas industry. That to me is code for we're playing Russian roulette. The reality of the impost that we have across our landscape is we have these wells, we have these pipelines, we have these compression stations. We are not operating under the same land management rules in the agricultural sector as what the coal seam gas or the resource sectors are in some areas. We're seeing the impost of this infrastructure across our facilities, whether it be a laser-levelled intensive irrigated cotton paddock that I've invested millions of dollars into to get to that sense, and I suddenly have a coal seam gas well in the middle of it. Or even if it's just purely an extensive grazing industry where I suddenly find 36 wells across a 5,000 acre property. We also then have the reality that this is a hit and run industry. The coal seam gas production from a well is only about 10 to 15 years in longevity. Now, the agricultural production I've already mentioned has been there for generations now, and sustainably done so will be there for generations to come, if not in perpetuity. The reality of coal seam gas wells is the industry as a whole in Queensland, and you can ask any of the companies, they're actually proposing to be removed from the economy and from the industry perspective by about 2040. And that's only because of the graduated process of rollout of wells at this point in time. They're also saying that the full impact of this industry and of these works will not be felt until 2065.
And what do you mean by that Drew? What do you mean the full impact won't be felt?
Well, the main impact of that longevity issue is more around the governance of water. And it's not just contamination, it's also drawdown. If an agricultural landholder wants to extract water from whatever aquifer, we need to get an extractive licence. And that extractive licence is done because it's a sustainable take, therefore that level is set as a sustainable level. A coal seam gas well will extract millions of litres of water over its life. It does have a curve to it, for those of you who understand the production of these systems. The upfront generation of water is normally greater than the upfront generation of gas. Over time, that does weld off. Now, the reality is that over time, we are putting 40,000 pinpricks into these aquifers and sucking gigalitre upon gigalitre of water out. Now, the reality of the porosity of these aquifers and the coal seams that they're in is the movement of water is obviously not instantaneous. So it will take some time for the aquifer to actually resettle. Now, the reality also at this point in time of why an agricultural system has an allocated licence, it's because of that sustainable yield. In Queensland,
Professor, I'll come back to you.
In Queensland, the CSG wells do not have an allocatable licence because it's not considered a sustainable take. Therefore, why would you put a sustainable licence on it?
Okay.
That's the Queensland Government's own explanation.
I'm going to pick up the water issue with Chris Moran, and then we'll probably come back to...
we cannot let what he said without a response. I mean, this is... Please, I mean, there is no statement of fact in what he's saying right now. They are totally unconnected. The drinking water aquifers that agriculture is going to use and the water that comes from a coal seam gas, they are totally unconnected, separated by hundreds or thousands of feet of impermeable rock. There is no connection.
Do you understand? I don't mean any disrespect, but do you understand the geological formations in Australia where it's happening?
Absolutely.
So why are the companies themselves coming back to us saying we will have these impacts? And the environmental authorities that they've got and the licences that they've got, they are saying we will have these impacts.
Okay, we're going to move on because we need to. We will pick up the issue. I'm not suggesting that we won't come back to it. Drew, I wanted to talk to you then. Farmers are huge users of transport fuel and electricity to run their operations. If not CSG, then what? Because we've actually got crunch coming. If it's not CSG, what are we going to do?
Oh, very much, Karen. That's why we're saying it needs to be in balance and it needs to be sustainable. We're not saying there's no room or no place for this industry. It's a very important industry, not just for Queensland but internationally as well. But we need to have that balance. It's not the reality of where would you put it, but we do not know what the sustainability is of that 40,000 wells. It's purely a numbered target at this point in time to reach international obligations to go through an LNG plant based at Gladstone.
So what is your suggestion then?
Well, our suggestion...
In terms of balance and sustainability...
Yeah, our suggestion at this point in time, and our policy on this, is we've actually been calling for a moratorium of this for quite some time. If we've got 3,500 to 4,000 wells right now, that's statistically 10% of that 40,000 proposed. Surely that's enough of this industry in situ right now, and yes, the majority of it servicing the domestic market, and we're looking now at the international market, but surely there's enough of that industry in there right now to actually identify what these impacts that the companies are telling us will happen, to identify what those impacts will be, to ground truth the modelling that we're all praying is correct, to then look at whether or not 40,000 is sustainable. Because what happens if 40,000 isn't and only 10 is? Or what happens if 100,000 is sustainable? Okay. We've got different issues then, but surely we've got enough now to find out what the realities are.
So the issue that you're concerned about and the reason why you're calling for a moratorium is because you're interested in the sustainability of the water use?
The water is
the issues of contamination?
No, water is our primary concern, both quality and quantity. But the secondary reality there is also our landscape competition and our ability to still have the landscape to provide for our food and fibre production. Okay.
I'm still not clear from you where you think there is a solution, but we're going to keep moving and we'll come back to it. Environmentalists have actually long promoted gas as a cleaner energy resource than coal and as a viable transitional fuel on the road to renewables. But just in the last week, this message has changed federally, and it appears that the push is on for an immediate move to 100% renewable energy. I want to call on Adam Stone, the Queensland Greens candidate. Can you tell us, Adam, if anything, what's changed in the thinking that means that you're now going full steam for 100% renewables?
Well, I don't think anything's changed in the thinking. I mean, I think And I still don't, as far as the Greens are concerned, anyway, I can't speak for, I mean, environmentalists are a sort of wide-ranging and disparate group. As far as the Greens are concerned, our position is still not never coal seam gas, and our position is certainly not never natural gas anywhere ever from any source. Our concerns with the coal seam gas industry overlap significantly with what Drew has just been talking about. It's to do with the sustainability of it, it's to do with impacts on groundwater resources, it's to do with the impacts on our productive farmland, and we've also got questions about the overall life cycle greenhouse intensity of the process. But that's not to say that we're opposed to natural gas from anywhere. And I'm aware of different sort of, I mean, obviously everyone would be aware that the Greens' position is that we should be, as far as our energy consumption is concerned, we should be moving to the cleanest available energy mix in terms of greenhouse gas intensity that we can within the shortest possible time frame. I've seen different sort of roadmaps about how that might be achievable and exactly what the steps along the road would be and what the ultimate mix of energy sources would be. You mentioned the Beyond Zero stationary energy plan. That's probably one of the more ambitious that I've seen in terms of saying 100% renewables within 10 years without any gas. There have been other roadmaps. I've seen one that was sponsored by Greenpeace somewhere in the 2000s that did see a heavy role for gas as a transition fuel. Mark Diesendorf from the University of New South Wales writes a lot about this. In some of his roadmaps you see gas, in others you don't. I personally, as a non-energy expert, don't know whether it's possible to do it without gas or not. But in any case, that's not our position. I think we're looking at doing it in the cleanest available way. But we don't think it's acceptable to say, okay, if gas is going to be somewhere in that mix, then it needs to be coal seam gas and it needs to be dug up from underneath Australian farmland, while there are unanswered questions about what the long-term impacts of that would be. And it's not just the Greens and it's not just farmers saying that there may be impacts on underground water resources. Some of the bodies that we turn to for expert advice in this area have also raised similar concerns, such as the National Water Commission, which in their position paper towards the end of last year raised these exact same concerns. They said, we don't know what the interconnection is between all of these aquifers in every case. We don't know what the impact is going to be of depressurising some of these aquifers, even if it's only temporarily, and then we repressurise them. We don't know whether we might make interconnections between these aquifers through the fracking process. There was also, sometime last year, I think it was actually the Coalition in the Federal Parliament got a document released from the Federal Environment Department that was their own internal advice to the government from their water group within the Environment Department. And they also said, we are concerned that there are substantial risks here that we can't evaluate on the available information. So our position is really, while we can't evaluate those risks and while we can't discount them, let's call the thing to a halt and have a look at it and then decide what we do once the research is in. And I know CSIRO have just started their own research project into some of these questions. That's anticipated to go for about 5 years. I've had email contact with one of the people who's overseeing that project in CSIRO just because I was curious about exactly what risks they're going to be covering. And it pretty much covers the full sort of suite of our concerns. So 5 years doesn't seem like a very long time.
That's the duration
to try to get
of the
some data
moratorium that you're suggesting, 5 years?
I mean, our position is that we want to call the thing to a halt until we can answer those questions. If it turns out that CSIRO can do that within 5 years, then I guess we'd reevaluate them. But it's impossible for me to say what would come out of that project. Okay.
I think we're probably going to need to get an industry view on just what the implications of waiting 5 years are, because of course part of the economic push is going to be servicing markets that could be potentially serviced other ways. But I want to ask you whether or not you from your understanding of the relationships between government, industry and the environmental sector, understanding that that's a lot of different interests, do you think industry and government understands your concerns?
I would certainly hope so. We keep on voicing them.
And where I'm going with this is there going to be some resolution of it? I mean, do you see some light at the end of the day? What I see in terms of the way that this issue is playing out in the media and in sort of general community awareness is that you seem to have some quite hostile and conflicting kinds of views going on. I'd be really comforted to know that actually there is some good discussion happening between the parties that are interested to take the issue forward. Is that what you're seeing happening?
Between government, industry and
the environmental sector? Because I'm hearing from you and also from Drew that you see that there is still a role for mining and CSG in agricultural areas, that's what I'm interpreting that you're saying. I want to be sure that you feel like the discussions are moving us forward to find that balance and sustainability. Drew's shaking his head. I'll stick with Adam though.
Well, I mean, if those conversations are happening, I'm not involved in them. But that, I mean, you know, I'm a candidate in a state election campaign as opposed to an elected representative representing the Greens and being involved in these negotiations. So I wouldn't be involved in them. I know that some discussions have happened at the political level and certainly in the federal parliament, because some of those have played out in the public domain over recent weeks. But no, I mean, I don't see any change of view from the other parties, and certainly there's been no change of view on our part because we haven't seen any data that would support a change of view. So no, I don't really feel very optimistic at this stage. But I guess this is, you know, still got some way to go in terms of playing out. But I don't really know what could happen that would lead to some sort of change of view, given that, at least in the political space, both of our major parties are happy enough for this industry to go on ahead unchecked. So there's probably not much need to negotiate, in the sense that doesn't seem to be much standing in the way that can't be crashed through.
Do you see that the industry's going ahead unchecked, though? I mean, in Queensland at least, CSG projects, and I'm not sure about shale oil, but CSG projects have around 1,200 environmental regulations or approval regulations that they need to meet. What's the unchecked nature that you're talking about?
Well, I guess the unchecked nature is that the industry is still going ahead despite any resolution of these sort of main concerns that I'm raising, and it's hard to imagine how conditions could adequately account for them, given that the problems aren't properly understood, the risks aren't properly understood.
Okay. I want to continue along that line, but I want to switch to Chris Moran, if we could, please. Chris is the director of the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. With enormous expertise in agricultural and soil science, as well as a more recent focus on the impacts of mining on water resources. Chris, of what you've heard tonight, which of the issues that we're talking about do you see as being most critical?
Look, the issue is the issue we're here to talk about, which is informing the debate properly. We've actually had a microcosm of this debate, haven't we? We've got Armageddon, impossibility, and no impact. Now, they're probably all correct, or they're probably all incorrect. I'm going incorrect. So the real feature of the debate that we've got is the poor quality of the debate. And I'd come back to something Professor Economides said at the beginning. How many people have read how much of this information? And you know what? Almost nobody can. The quantity of information that is being generated at the moment by coal seam gas companies on the problems that we don't know anything about is incredible. Each of the environmental impact statements was 20,000 pages. The supplements to the environmental impact statements were another 10,000 pages. Each of the companies that have been supported at the moment that have produced the first pass materials, the stage 1 plans for response to the federal government only, the federal government conditions, each of those runs out to at least 1,500 pages each. Put your hand up if you've read 1% of that information. Put your hand up if you can imagine reading 0.1% of that information. So, Professor, I agree with you that it's very important that in the technical discussions that people try to get on top of the technical issues. There is an impossibility of how we go about getting on top of all the information and therefore informing the debate of some ridiculous statements that have been made about what we don't know and some ridiculous statements that have been made about things that can't possibly happen, that can happen. So what we have to do is we have to acknowledge that the natural environment is complex. We will never have enough data about the natural environment to make certain decisions about the way we manage it. What we have always done and what we will always do is adaptively manage. What we've done very poorly is adaptively manage in an organised way, in a way where we actually treat it as a scientific process rather than trial and error, whoops, trial and error, whoops. For goodness sake, Australian agriculture, if you go back and read the history of Australian agriculture in the 1930s and 40s, people were screaming. They were screaming at the government because metres of soil were disappearing overnight. This is not fiction or myth. This is documented, and it's been redocumented in work that we did for the Murray-Darling Basin Commission several years ago. We have fundamentally changed the face of this continent in managing natural resources. We have fundamentally over-extracted the water resources of the system. First the surface water resources, and then the groundwater resources. They are connected. The systems are connected. We know they're connected because in many places our rivers don't run anymore. They haven't run for many years. They can run again if you understand that the recharge processes occur in big pulses and the extraction occurs every year. You have to also understand and look at the information that's out there historically on the way that we've analysed the continent. The federal government has put a lot of money through CSIRO in particular, but also through state governments, in understanding the natural resources of Australia. The National Land and Water Resources Audit was produced in the year 2000 to 2001. It showed that the majority of agricultural land in Australia shows a net return, a net negative return, at full equity. Almost none of Australia's agricultural lands are in full equity. By far the majority of returns from Australian agriculture come from irrigation. They come from irrigation in area where the soil is either reasonable or good. Really very small areas where you have this coincidence of water and soil. We have one of those that's heating this debate, that's making these silly generalisations. We have the Liverpool Plains in New South Wales and the Darling Downs in Queensland, two fantastic places. They're fantastic because they have water and soil that coincide. Not because of the soil inherently. We have soil like this in other places in Australia. We're not very interested in it because we don't have water for it, or it's salty because it's been there for so long. The overlap area between this and mining and coal seam gas, the quotation numbers of what's actually happening needs to come to the table, and that needs to be put against the actual change of production that's under threat. We invented the stump jump plough until we figured out how to get rid of all the trees so we could get really big ploughs. Now we've got a problem that apparently we can't plough between 500 metre spacings. So let's get some of the nonsense and the heat from the political positioning, start to get into how we've managed natural resources, the way we're going to continue to manage natural resources. We're not going to have a moratorium. We're not going to have a moratorium. We've got a coal seam gas industry. We've got a hell of a lot of information that can be analysed, that can be read, that can be digested, that gives you a reasonable sense of the risks. In 2006, we produced a document for, 2008 rather, we produced a document for the Queensland government. We laid out these risks. They're known. They're not impossible to occur. They will occur. They will occur in some places. They will not occur everywhere. Stop the hysteria about these things occurring everywhere. They will not occur everywhere. Water will move extremely slowly in the majority of places. Some of that water may actually be formation coal water. It may be hundreds of millions of years old. That's the kind of rates. We haven't gone anywhere near that water. The rates of movement around that are going to be incredibly slow. They aren't anywhere near the surface aquifers that we're using. In most of the places, they interact with surface aquifers in areas that we're beginning to know, and some that we know quite well. And we should focus attention in those areas, we should get the monitoring into those areas, and we should risk manage those areas very carefully. And we should stop taking 50,000 square kilometres and treating it the same as 2,000 square kilometres. Sort the problem, figure out where we really need to focus attention, get some of the heat out of it, and get some technical advice, get some research, and get the information that we need. We've got to calm down. I'm not getting very calm, am I? We've got because what we're doing is we're just clouding the possibility of managing the issue with noise. And we've got a community out there that's panicky and hysterical. We aren't focusing on where the real issues are, where we can really make a difference with research and where we can really make a difference with the technical information we've got. So the first thing that I would do is I would get the information that is available in the state from the agricultural community, from the coal seam gas companies, and get it to the scientific community.
What's stopping that from happening?
If I buy something, why should I give it to you?
Okay. So a simple
It's
sharing
mine.
of...
It's mine. It's my information. If I purchase that information at the cost of tens to hundreds of millions of dollars, we're not talking small amounts of money. We're not talking small amounts of money. That information is now making its way to the Queensland Water Commission. That's a good thing. It will never come out of the Queensland Water Commission. Only the results of modelling will come out of the Queensland Water Commission. That's a really big problem for scientists. Doesn't matter whether it's the CSIRO, doesn't matter whether it's the University of Queensland, doesn't matter if it's the Queensland Water Commission. If we don't know anything about the quality of the models with respect to the data that went in there, and we can't know anything about that, very difficult for us to build our confidence. What was the question?
I'm moving on to another question. You talked earlier about panic and hysteria. I mean, part of the thing that drives this, I think, is that the Great Artesian Basin, for example, is as iconic in Australians' minds as the Great Barrier Reef is. And so when we hear that CSG particularly, but mining generally, on agricultural land, for example, is threatening the Great Artesian Basin, I think that's part of where the hysteria and panic comes from. From your professional and experience and knowledge, is it at risk? You know, what are the risks around the Great Artesian Basin? Do we need to be worried? And if we do, you mentioned that sometimes some of the potential risks could happen. What if we do get it seriously wrong? What's the risk?
Armageddon has already been vested upon the Great Artesian Basin. It's called extensive grazing. We depressurise vast areas of the Great Artesian Basin. We've had a program in the last few years to try to repressurise locally some of those areas, and they are responding. So we've capped bores and we've used pipes. So instead of using in the desert open channels to move water, we've used pipes. What a brilliant idea. We've capped some of the open bores so that we're not just having water running through the desert for no particular purpose, and we're seeing repressurisation in some places. So we have depressurised large parts of the Great Artesian Basin. We've done it in areas where there's good water. If you're an agriculturalist, if you're a farmer and you're looking for water and someone drills a hole and you find salty water, what do? Well, you fill in the hole and you find another place where you don't get salty water. So we've got really a very nice sample of fresh water. So we know quite well where the fresh water is. We also know that these aquifers are not simple layers underground where everything is the same. They're incredibly complex. They fine as you move up. They have bands in them of clays. They have bands in them of fine materials. There's actually coals throughout the place. For example, the Walloon coal measures, the target that we're talking about for coal seam gas, only has about 20% of the layers in there that have and produce gas. This is a thing that's hundreds of metres thick. Now, these are small bands that sit in there. So think of the landscape that's out there now. Think of where the trees are, where the rivers are, where the beaches are, and squash all that down by a factor of 10. And that's why you've got all this complexity out there in the landscape when you drill holes through it this way. So sometimes you're going through rock, occasionally you go through coal. That's what the Walloon coal measures look like. Above and below them are other systems, the so-called Great Artesian Basin aquifers. The Walloon coal measure is a Great Artesian Basin aquifer. They've got all these layers of rocks and fine materials, and then within these other aquifers themselves you have great variability. So what can happen as you take a hole through there, you've got to case that hole very carefully so that you don't get exchange, just direct exchange through the bore itself. What we then do is we depressurise and remove the water from these multiple layers within the Walloon coal measures. I'm just using them as an example, they're not the only ones. So what you've done now is reversed the usual direction of the head. The water, like heat, will move from hot to cold. Water will move to equalise pressure. So if you create a low pressure, then there's a natural desire, if you like, if water has desire to move into that place. That's actually the water movement we're talking about. The main water movement we're not talking about is radical vertical hydraulic fractures opening and renting the earth. The main water movement we're talking about is reversing the natural head, and therefore we're into these very slow water movements. Fast water movement from the pumping, slow water movement towards the Walloon coal measures. So our fear of the higher aquifers, our risk of the higher aquifers, that they're subsequently connected. But they could be 100 or 200 metres away. So in the majority of the landscape, we shouldn't have those fears. We shouldn't spread those fears. What we should look very closely is where the landscape, where these coal measures come up towards the surface, where the Great Artesian Basin aquifers come up near the surface, where the modern aquifers are up near the surface, around the rivers, around the highly productive agricultural areas in this case, where you will get interaction. And now the distances are not quite so far. So when you reverse the head, now you can actually get water movement in those areas. They're the ones we should watch. They're the ones we should be looking at signatures on. And they're the ones we should risk manage very carefully, particularly if they're overlying irrigation areas that are highly productive.
How long might it take us to know that there is a negative impact happening there?
We should know very quickly.
It's happening now.
We should know very quickly. What we haven't done, and what we've asked the Queensland Government to do 5 years ago, I did, was to get geochemical signatures of the various aquifers. Why don't we know this? We should know this. You should have known this 50 years ago. For managing agriculture, we should know our aquifers properly. And we should have that information. We should have had it. We should get it now. We should stop messing around, get the signatures on those aquifers so that when they do mix, when we do measure things, we know and we can say, where is it coming from? What are we going to do about it? That's adaptively managing the aquifer system.
Okay, thank you. I really want, at this point, to throw to the audience and get some questions going of the panel. We're not going to get a whole lot of time just because it's been such a sort of deep conversation already. We're not going to get a whole lot of time for interaction between the panel. I really want to make sure that you in the audience have got time to ask questions, so we'll do that now. The way that I want to do that, though, is we are recording this evening for a podcast. So if you have a question, can you please put your hand up, but then can you please wait for the microphone to get to you? One question at a time, and please respect the expertise of the panel that you have, but also the audience members that are here as well. And I don't want a lot of long statements. I want some succinct questions, please. Up the back here, thanks. And could you also, when you get the microphone,
Testing.
just your name would be great, thanks, so that we know who we're talking to.
Testing.
Yep.
You can hear that?
You can, thank you.
My name's Angus. I just want to know, this fracking has been going on overseas, as we've heard from Texas, so there's a lot of information gathered from many decades of it being used there. All of that information, how can we transplant that information into the experience that we have in Australia? For example, the geology. Is that useful?
Is it transferable?
Is it transferable? Yes.
Thank you, great question. I might go to Professor Economides and then I might ask Professor Moran.
Yeah, let me just, I had a revelation while Professor Moran was talking over here. And let me correct so people cannot, is relevant to this question, what I have said before. I was under the presumption that there has been a mapping 50 years ago, as you have suggested, of the coal seams and the water aquifers. Because my admonition earlier on was under that presumption that these are already were mapped already, and people wouldn't actually go and drill in places with geologic communication. Okay, that would be pretty silly to do. You agree? You know. So I was under the presumption in my comments earlier on. So going back to your statement, to the question, of course, you know, geology is geology, and geology is complicated. And I'm not a geologist, by the way. I'm just a user of geology myself. But certainly, the technology for hydraulic fracturing is particularly robust. There is nothing wrong with hydraulic fracturing in applications with, of course, the knowledge of the geology that we are fracking in. In other words, we have to make certain presumptions. Listen, none of us in the oil business, the oil and gas business, are really interested to go out there. You know, we are not black hat wearing Dick Cheneys, okay? I mean, we are very much interested to do the job in the right way. I myself am very worried about fracture height migration that I mentioned earlier on before. So the geology, as well as what we are injecting and the kind of things we do, they come hand in hand, but we never inject blindly. In other words, part of the model itself is to take into account the geology we're going to frack, okay? So rule number one, if I was working in Australia, is the first thing I'm going to do is try to learn the place I'm going to go and work on, obviously. Okay? And then we're going to discount all of the dangerous places a priori, whether some independent group is going to do that, like your group, for example, or somebody else. That needs to be done. Geological study has to be done. I was under the presumption that people are not drilling here where there is a communication, for crying out loud. I mean, and I presume they are not.
Thanks. I'll move on to Professor Moran for a comment.
I think there are two things there. One about the communication. I think obvious, where there's obvious connection, that you know those things. It's actually more subtle from the point of view of very old landscapes. The point I would make about fracturing, and Professor Economides can correct me if I'm incorrect, but I don't think so, is we actually have some advantages here in that system that I talked about before, where you have lenses of coal actually sitting between shales and mudstones. So you have a much stronger probability of that horizontal propagation, because the coal is so much less strong than the rocks. So you can imagine you only need to apply the force. You don't want to spend money, time and effort applying force into that system to break something you don't want to break. So that's quite handy. The downside of that, if you like, is as you propagate this way, and they are horizontal, I don't think there's any doubt about that. The question is whether you potentially create connections between areas that have other communication. That's actually, it's a secondary effect that you would be interested in there, and the modelling and microseismics that we would do and need to have done around the fracturing in coals is incredibly important. I think the other issue that needs to be thought through, and it's another big issue, so we probably don't have a lot of time for it tonight, but it's the whole question of re-injection and repressurisation. And if we're going back into those same systems as a way of recreating pressure in the future, then the fracturing of the coal seams and the extraction of water and gas actually changes the coal itself. Whereas in shales, okay, you change the structure, but the microstructure of the shales is essentially preserved in fracturing. Whereas in coal, that can change. And that's a valid area of fundamental research for us to be doing. And there is work, and has been work going on for some time at UQ on that. But more work needs to be done.
Thank you. Question down the front, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Rolf Kilson. I understand one of the byproducts of the coal seam gas is salt in quite large quantities. What is the solution, or what is going to be done with all that salt down the track?
The question here is really the question around water management. So that if you have a situation, and this is often the situation in the US, and the life can be a lot simpler often with shale in the US, where one, you've got lower volumes of water, but you have much higher salt, is you can re-inject that water deep straight back into another saline aquifer that has no purpose. Part of the reason why we've got quite complicated in the discussion in Australia, there are two reasons. One, we don't want to surface store the water and wait until the coal seams are re-available, if you like, to put the same water back into them, because we don't want to take up a lot of land and evaporate water. But actually the main reason is there's been quite a strong push for beneficial use of water. So if we're going to take the water, and I need to correct something I think that's quite important, which is under a petroleum licence, you're right, you don't need a licence to remove the water to the surface, but you can't do anything with it after that without getting a licence. So you've either got to put it back or get a licence. So the licensing thing occurs when you move into the beneficial use. For beneficial use, there are a number of things you can do. You can use it directly on the surface. If it's too salty, you can't use it directly for agriculture. You may be able to dilute it. There are quite a few farmers around who are interested in volumes of water being put into very large surface water storages, just straight dilution. The other thing you can do is you can inject it into other areas. Right, so you can inject it into other aquifers that you have used or overused. Now the problem is you've got a salty water source, you don't want to inject that into a good aquifer, so you need to clean the water. You effectively have to remove the salt from the water, and then you can re-inject once you've got what you think is a reasonable water quality match with underground, and you're left over with the brine. What they're doing with the brines at the moment, or the way they're dealing with the brine issue at the moment, they're looking really in two directions. One is disposal/storage of brines per se, that is repositories effectively of salt. The other is to take them right through to crystalline form, and then actually to separate the salts and to start to produce products. This has been done in the Murray. You may have seen this Murray River salt. That's actually produced by a set of bores that are holding salt water back out of the River Murray from long-term agricultural use of the lands of the Lower Murray. That salt can also have metals and other things that you can extract for value. My view is that won't happen in the short term. That'll be something that has to happen in the longer term. So we should be building, I think, salt repositories, not salt disposal areas. The calculations, back of the envelope calculations that I've had a look at, would say that over a 30-year period on a kind of a big scale, a sort of worst case scenario from the point of view of how much water and how much salt you might have, you produce over 30 years about 10% of 1 year global supply of salt. It's to kind of just give you a ballpark figure. Now that's a horrible amount of salt to have in your backyard. So again, we've got to be looking after our soil. We do this in irrigation areas already. If you look in the River Murray irrigation areas, amongst the irrigation areas are salt disposal basins where effectively water that's too salty that's getting in the root zone for irrigation is taken out for evaporation and have long-term storage of brine from evaporation. So we have a good technical knowledge on how to manage them as disposal basins. I'd prefer if we were looking at them as long-term repositories.
Okay, thanks. We had 2 questions here.
Hi, my name's Jeffrey Chia. I'm a physician. Professor Economides asked us to declare our position from the outset, so I'd like to say that my position is that I believe that our beliefs and actions should be determined by the best peer-reviewed scientific research. And you made a few comments. You were saying that anybody who opposes fossil fuels are rabid fossil fuel haters, and people are wasting the time talking about climate change. So I'd like to ask you: do you believe that anthropogenic global warming is a problem?
Do I believe anthropogenic? This is a very good Greek word. Yes, of course. I mean, there is an element of anthropogenic global warming. Yes, for sure. Why not? What's the question here?
Is it a problem, or are we just wasting our time talking about it and go?
It is a problem for certain, but there is no alternative to hydrocarbon energy sources. In other words, it is a problem. We have to live with it, and I do not believe in some of the more dire predictions of what anthropogenic global warming would do, but whether it is a problem or not is certainly, the scientific evidence is overwhelming that there is anthropogenic global climate change. Okay, not just global warming, but global climate change. So yes, why not? But what you are going to do about this, that's a very big question, which nobody has the answer for that, especially in the current economic climate of the world. Okay, and that's why my rhetorical question is: do you really believe, even if the most the direst of all predictions there are true, do you really believe that anything can be done about this? Do you believe that there are going to be economically extractable hydrocarbons in the world? That's the question that I posed, that would not be produced because of global climate change policy. Okay, I don't think so.
Can I respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So as a physician, I always have to talk about benefits and risks of everything we do. And one of the big problems of modern industrial society is immense waste. So unfortunately, we are poisoning ourselves and over-consuming and producing excessive waste, incredibly fattened from our modern industrial society. Sure. So, it's just, a physician might say you're due for big trouble because of that overconsumption, heart attack or whatever, and they would advise you to reduce the consumption and exercise more. And same thing, a prescription for this problem is to reduce consumption and move to some more healthy diet of renewables rather than fossil fuels. But I see it all the time. My patients just ignore me and
send me your invoice. I'll pay. Okay. For sure.
All right. I'd really like to move on to another question, if I could, please.
Good point.
Free checkup.
I have a free checkup here.
My name is John Zapancic. I've worked in beneficial reuse of wastewater since 1983 and worked on energy projects and other related issues for a long time. And I'm trying to understand the impacts to the agricultural systems of Queensland. And I'd like to know from Drew and perhaps Chris, what sort of losses in agricultural production do you foresee with the development of coal seam gas should we go to 40,000 wells?
Drew first, I think.
We're already seeing the reduction of head height or reduction of pressure in some of the aquifers that are currently being used for agricultural production. The farmers will tell you that, the coal seam gas companies will tell you that, the Queensland government will tell you that, to the point where they've even set trigger thresholds for remediation works to be done over the last 12 or 18 months. if it gets to the point where these aquifers, through whatever interaction occurs, are either contaminated beyond the point of use or drawn down to a point of not being commercially extractable for that production system, then some of that production won't exist. But we're not just talking about the irrigated areas, we're not just talking about the intensive cropping regimes, because intensive cropping only covers about 4% of the state. We're talking about stock and domestic water that we have extraordinary large percentage of the population of Queensland that is reliant on that. If we talk about the Darling Downs that Chris mentioned earlier, in the Western Downs Regional Council there are 21 towns. 19 of those rely on these aquifers for 100% of their water.
Okay. I'm going to ask Chris to respond too, though, because I thought that what Chris was saying was that we weren't going to have impacts on our agricultural aquifers. Chris?
No, I don't think I said that. What I tried to do was to bring the problem down to those acute areas. I think town water supplies is important to protect town water supplies, and from my perspective, that's one of the areas of risk you look at very closely for aquifer connection. Sorry for reading, but I was actually looking for some numbers because we have looked through those numbers before, and the rates of decline of aquifers in the region are very difficult to separate from historical rates from the times of CSG change because of the significant changes that have occurred under agricultural over-extraction. Now, that's not pointing the finger at a given agriculturalist. That's actually a failure of governance, of water governance, and we have a failure of water governance around the country. You don't know that from an individual well that you're the cause of a general regional issue. But because we've had these declines in groundwater availability and groundwater pressures over a long period of time, and we've kept up to them by pumping harder, we haven't seen a feedback on the production system because we've managed to keep up the supply. The question really is around this whole timing of where we get major recharge events into those superficial aquifers and get enough recharge that we can keep running a bit faster. Some areas of Liverpool Plains, as I think, felt it much harder than the Darling Downs, where allocations have been reduced, and there has been an attempt with understanding those aquifers to bring them much closer into how much water really is available on an annual basis for what level of production, and we've seen production decreases as a result of that. The production decreases as a result of less water tend to have been picked up by agricultural research that's allowed an improved yield through better management of the land, better management of the soil, better care of the soil, for example. So you've got competing technologies in there to try to figure out what the productivity loss would be. I think it's right in if we come to the other mining area, which we haven't focused much on open cut, I think it's not clear that once you take the surface soil away and open cut in these areas, that we've yet done sufficient research to be sure that we get the same level of productivity. We can grow things afterwards, we can graze and whatever, we know we can do that. Whether we can move that back into irrigated agriculture, it's certainly possible. We know we've laser levelled very large areas, we've cut through Gilgai country, so we know we can deal with a lot of heterogeneity in the soil and still produce a lot. So I guess my short answer to you is there's a lot of kind of technological competition in there. It's not just about how much water you've got at a given amount of time as to how much production. Again, this is in those areas where you do have intensive production. I don't think we should have hysteria over rain-fed agriculture and dry, extensive grazing areas that are rain-fed. Town water supplies, no doubt at all. We should be securing town water supplies for those areas. But as far as the extensive production around those areas that are dry land, I don't think that we should be thinking there'll be large impacts there or any discernible impacts on production.
The state government's recent announcement that they're putting in I think a 2 kilometre exclusion zone from towns over 1,000 people, is that, Drew, you're smiling and shaking your head, is that not sufficient or it is sufficient for the concern about town water supplies?
Regardless of town water, I mean, the impost of a 2 kilometre buffer zone around towns over 1,000 means there's a hell of a lot of small towns in Queensland that aren't protected that same affordability, and there's a hell of a lot of rural and regional communities and families that are not protected the same. So to put a buffer zone around what is quite undeniably a quite naive process of saying, but we've put these buffer zones in to protect the greater good, there's a hell of a lot of Queensland you've not just protected, and there's a hell of a lot of Queensland you just said you're obviously a second-class citizen compared to some of those in other towns. But that's a very different debate than what we're here for tonight.
All right, thanks. I'll ask for another question. Just in the middle over here, I think. Oh, and sorry, and then we'll come back to you. Thanks.
Can I just make one comment just while we're heading towards that question? one of the biggest issues that we have is often discussing this with landholders. We've been doing extensive work trying to assist landholders and understand all of these processes. And it's not pro-agriculture, it's not pro-CSG, it's just what their rights are and where they stand. The reality of this entire industry is, we're talking about a gas industry here. It's not a gas industry, ladies and gentlemen. It's a water industry that has gas as a byproduct. Because the majority of their production to start with is water. What we do with that water, how we manage that water, where the water goes, what contaminations that water have, what pressurisation changes that has within the aquifers, they're the issues that we need to deal with. Because right now, these companies that are representing the CSG industry, they can sell their gas. They've got their forward contracts in. That's fantastic. That's great for the economy. That's great for jobs. It's great for whatever other process you want to say. But the reality of that water is still to us, unfortunately, as a Queensland community, the multi-billion-dollar question.
Okay, thanks, Drew. Please.
My name's Hannah, and I'm just interested to hear, probably from Chris, industries claiming, gas industries and the government is claiming that gas produced from coal seams will burn at up to 70% less emissions than coal-fired power stations. I'm just interested to hear whether you think enough, whether adequate study's been done to show that through the full production, full life cycle of the gas being produced, whether this is actually the case, it's actually going to be less. I know that there's been a recent study done at Cornell University that has shown shale gas rather than coal seam, I know there's differences, may not actually produce less emissions than coal, and this is because of the methane leaked during the process. And in Australia, where there's high fire risks, the methane, when they're testing wells, is often just leaked straight into the atmosphere instead of being flared off.
Chris?
I hear noise to my right, so someone else has obviously read the same paper.
I mean, this is the Cornell study has been thoroughly discredited by Cornell University. You guys are 6 months behind times, okay? I'm sorry. Please go and Google it tonight, okay? And you see how discredited that study from Cornell University has been. It's ridiculous, okay? Why I would come over here in Queensland and hear about the Cornell study tonight is very disheartening, frankly.
Chris, please.
It was interesting when it came out last week, and there was a big political hoo-ha about it last week. When I first heard it was about emissions, I immediately thought, someone's finally realised how much energy is required to manage the water, and we're going to figure out the additional indirect energy associated with the water. But indeed it wasn't, it was this other paper. I was approached by the Queensland Government and APIA straight away to say, did we know about the paper? Do we know about other information around this? And the two key points that are in that paper that need data behind them are the so-called flowback associated with fracturing. So how much gas actually is produced that you don't capture during the process of fracturing, and how much venting occurs. Venting is an interesting concept. Venting is a creation of engineering where your downstream compressing system, where you bring gas and whatnot together, can't quite cope with the rates of flows coming out everywhere. So occasionally you get a little bit of extra gas back in the system. You can't stop, so you vent that gas. So you have those two components in the Cornell study that came up with very high numbers for one of the shale formations. So we don't know what those numbers may or may not look like. So one of them is engineering, well, they're both engineering based. So one of the beauties of that is it brings in this whole carbon tax question. How much would you pay to save that gas? Would you pay $23 a tonne CO2 equivalent for that gas? And if you would, then you would invest in the research that would create technology to trap the gas, at a minimum to flare it, right? If it's there, you flare it, you reduce the CO2 footprint of it immediately by a large margin. So I think the short answer to your question is I think we actually have to work through more of the life cycle. The water management energy component, I think, needs to be looked at so we understand it, so we really understand the footprint component. And the beauty of the problem of the other fugitive emissions associated with engineering is that there's technological, you can imagine technology to deal with that relatively simply. Now, can you actually create that for 23 or 8 euros a tonne? That's the key question on coming back to global climate change and response.
Okay, a question up here at the back, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to...
sorry, your name, please.
Simone, sorry. I just wanted to touch upon a few other environmental impacts that are associated with the activity. We have obviously discussed a range of environmental and social impacts tonight, which has been great. There's also... these projects are really the largest disturbance of land that we've seen in this state. And it's going to carve up millions of hectares of of vegetation and land and watercourse crossings, etc. And I'm just wondering, maybe Chris, if you could answer this, has anyone looked at the ecological costs associated with all of this and the economic costs and the social costs and put it all together over the long term to work out what that total cost is?
No, they haven't.
And so that we can make a sensible decision?
Look, I think I have to take exception to the introduction to your comment that this is the largest disturbance of the landscape that we've seen. It's not by any means the largest disturbance of the landscape. We're clearing in Australia and Queensland in particular at faster rates than the Amazon until very, very recent times, and we've created really very, very significant change. Now, we have precious systems left. And with 500 metre spacings with a line into each one, biodiversity fragmentation is a serious issue for those areas. There's good discussions, I think, going on between the government and the companies about offsetting of that. It's not a one-for-one offset. It's how much either other protection or other growth, and perhaps Drew knows more about those conversations on how they're progressing. So there's at least a positive conversation. The second part of your question, I think, is probably addressed best by looking at the new CSIRO program that's just been established with APLNG. It's called Jazeera. It's run by a chap called Peter Stone from CSIRO. And when they launched that a few weeks ago, the CEO of CSIRO was very strong that a large component of that would be to look at the whole systems issue. What would be the social, environmental, and could you bring that together? No one's ever done it, right? So no one's ever actually managed to make a kind of a good indicator statement over a region of change or even over an existing region. It's a very difficult thing to do, but you do need to do it. You do need to try to do it. And CSIRO have had a couple of goes at this before, so they have reasonable experience. They've done a pretty good job in the Goulburn Broken area in Victoria, New South Wales, and the irrigation there. They did a reasonable job of the Herbert River area quite some years ago as well, so there's good experience in that organisation, I think, for looking at those systems-wide issues. So they're on the case, and I just encourage you to go and talk to Peter Stone and get a sense of how they're going to progress that.
We've got time for just 2 more questions. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Kate. My understanding is that the Water Commission in New York City has been able to have coal seam gas activities excluded from the Catskills watershed. Did you hear the first bit? Yeah. And Chris nominated before the need to protect town water supplies as being an important factor to consider for the industry. So I'd just like to ask the panel what they consider the approach to exclude coal seam gas activities from drinking water supply watersheds as a compromised approach to a full moratorium.
Can I ask Adam Stone to start with that? Adam, would you have a view on that to start?
Sorry, I did miss part of the question. Were you saying that... Can you run that by me again?
So the full question was, my understanding is that the New York Water Commission has lobbied and been able to exclude coal seam gas activities from the Catskills watershed. And my question to the panel is, how would that approach in terms of excluding coal seam gas activities from drinking water supply catchments be as a compromise to a full moratorium on the activities?
Chris might have to correct me here, but if I understood what Chris was saying earlier correctly, I guess I'm still left with the impression that we haven't aggregated all of the data and formed a comprehensive picture of exactly what the picture is going to be on underground water supplies across the full breadth of the terrain where this industry is being considered. So based on my understanding, in the absence of that kind of data, then just excluding the areas where it might impact upon town water supplies would not account for the full range of potential problems. If we're looking at potential water contamination or unavailability either now or in 100 years when the water trickles from a highly pressurised place to a less pressurised place, and that's going to have an impact on agriculture or other beneficial uses of that water, then I think that would also be a concern that needs to be discounted before we roll on ahead with the industry. But I may have misunderstood Chris's explanation, so you might want to add to that.
I don't think I'd even go in that direction. I think we can understand the local systems. I'm not sure that's a very helpful for the people who want to sort of stop. Everything's going too fast. I'm frightened. I don't think that's a very satisfying emotional or intellectual response for those people, particularly because I think they're coming from a different position. I think Professor Economides, put that quite well at the beginning, that people are working from very different emotion and fear points. So I don't think that particularly helps. The direction I'd look at is the quantities of water as well. If a multi-billion-dollar company is faced with a make good provision over a rural water supply, it's actually a relatively easy engineering problem. So making good on the water for a few thousand people is a relatively simple task. Mining companies do this all the time, where they integrate the mine water supply with the town water supply for the town that would be supported by it. So they don't even necessarily look at local water supply as the solution to those towns' water needs. So I think that the capability of engineering to move water, to clean and make water available, for example, from the surrounding areas to those towns, is probably a relatively easy engineering problem. But I don't think the moratorium issue is an engineering question.
Okay. Can we have the last question for tonight, please?
From Friends of South East Queensland. Is this on?
Yep, thanks.
Okay. My issue, I tried to put it in small words, is probably about social justice. We understand that there's really 4 CSG companies that are investing and getting billions of dollars each year, even though they've only been around for a few years in this territory. My concern is that the short-term, medium-term and long-term for the farmers, the landowners, the communities, the population that lives here and the population that's served in the urban areas by these farmers or the landowners is a real concern. What can the community, what can people do about this? We can wait 5 years for a CSIRO report. We can wait for debate for state, federal and local governments to argue about certain things for many years. But what can we, the community, what can we, the people, do?
Thank you. I'm actually going to take that question and feed it to each of the panel as an opportunity to make some closing comments, please. But I'm going to start at this end because we've had a lot of focus down the other end at the moment. Wally White, what can the community do as a result of the discussion that we've heard tonight? Sum it all up for me. What can the community do to allay concern, but to also be part of, I think, some of the decisions and the discussions that are going on?
Yeah. I think part of the issue is to inform ourselves as community on not just the technologies, but about the responses. I think one of the things that Jeffrey touched on is that one of the issues about energy exploitation is that we have this intent to use more and more energy, and I think there are opportunities to have our community use less energy and put less pressure on the sources of energy. I don't think that we need to rely on accelerating our consumption in order to live a lifestyle that's worthwhile.
Thank you. Liam?
I hardly feel qualified in this, but I was thinking the information line and how already people go into entrenched positions and how little they maybe understand, or how simplistically they try to understand a problem. I guess for me it would be inform yourselves and be part of the debate and then be into the process. I think that's as best you can do. I mean, I realise the problem is that it's a difficult one, and I guess standing back from that, I think one of the things I notice about this is that we have had mining and we've had farming going on in Australia, but not necessarily in each other's pockets like it is occurring here, and so we're going through quite a significant change in that. We've been able to sort of do these things without impacting on each other. So there's a lot of working that out and working it through with each other before we actually be able to move forward, I think.
Michael?
Yeah, let me make this brief. That's the best question of the night, by the way. Thank you. Because this is really a dilemma, and it's a choice. If you look at the Japanese expected incremental natural gas demand after the Fukushima disaster, that's 1.5 TCF of gas, trillion cubic feet of gas per year. You take the Chinese expected increase in natural gas demand by the year 2020, based on what the NDRC, the National Development Reform Council, has decreed. That's going to add another 9 TCF of gas. Those of you that are engineers in this room, that's 10.5 TCF of incremental natural gas demand in the Pacific. That's, for a good measure, let me give you some numbers so you can understand this. 8 times what Australia is exporting today. You want to play that game? It's $100 billion per year that I'm estimating right now. Counting the multiplier in the economy, which is 4 times the multiplier, we are looking at an incremental economic activity that Australia could participate in on the order of $500 billion per year. That's about 2/3 of your current GDP. Okay? In other words, if Australia were to take any market share of this, believe me, many countries are interested. Qatar is interested. Russia is sitting over there at the end of pipelines. The Chinese are not interested to be Russified. So here you are. Probably there is no economic opportunity for Australia that comes even close to what I'm talking about right now. That would increase your GDP divided by 20 million people by about $25,000 per year. That's the magnitude we are talking about. All these other things we are talking about pale by comparison to this issue. Social justice, how much of that do you want to get, for example? Okay? That would be very good, by the way. So that's the magnitude. So every time you debate this issue from now on, remember we're discussing at a $500 billion incremental activity in the Pacific. That's the magnitude we are talking about. Japan and China.
Thank you. Drew?
I don't think I can come at it so capitalistic as that. I think the food security debate may need to play a role in that. Look, I think the commentary's already been made. Educating yourself in this process is very important. It's not just social justice, it's also social licence. You hear a lot of the companies talk about their social licence to operate. I believe that, yes, there are only 4 companies, and I believe that a lot of them are doing some good work towards that. Some of them have got a hell of a lot more to go on that journey than others do. There are some companies who have already recognised what those obligations are, and it's more than just giving some new jerseys to the local footy team and $5,000 to the local show. They're operating within communities across Queensland. They're operating in some very intensely settled areas, which is the big difference that we're seeing now, but they are across Queensland. They are part of our community, and they need to remember that, and part of that community needs to also recognise the sustainability of that community, whether it be rural, whether it be regional, whether it be a local town, city, whatever. To educate yourself on that process also then leads to them making some decisions as an individual. The only way we will influence this debate in any way is by working with those who make our legislation. Those who make our legislation are our politicians. If we believe strongly enough that we need to have an outcome, then they are the people that you need to be working with, like the gentleman to my left. Because the reality of whatever we decide as an individual means that we should also have the purpose and drive to carry that through. And if that means trying to affect change, well, that's where change can be affected.
Thank you. Adam?
Sorry, if there's anyone in the room that has anything in the library cloak room, it's just about to close.
Oh.
Whoops.
Whoops.
Our whole audience is leaving.
It's interesting when people's personal issues dominate over the big global ones, isn't it? Where's my handbag?
I'm sorry, gentlemen, I did not expect that response.
Wow.
Right, for those of you who are able to stay for another couple of minutes, we're very nearly done. Thank you. Over to you, please, Adam.
The question was about, how does an ordinary member of the community get involved in these issues and sort of pushing for what they see as being the preferred outcome. Is that right?
Well, not just ordinary.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, we're extraordinary.
Okay, good.
So give us a task, give us a challenge.
I think it's. I mean, there's lots of ways to get involved, and there obviously are lots of groups getting involved in different ways. Groups like Tues, obviously, the companies involved, governments are getting involved at all levels. Different community groups are popping up and weighing in when their community gets affected. Obviously, you can also try to influence the process by lobbying your politicians or casting your vote according to whoever you think is speaking the most sense on this issue. It's kind of I've got a lot of sympathy for people sort of trying to work out in which direction they should direct their endeavours in getting involved, because to me, certainly, and also to a lot of people I speak to, I think it is still, a lot of these issues we talk about are very murky, and the air is kind of thick with claim and counterclaim and purported statements of facts from various seemingly reputable bodies that don't properly align with one another. It can make it really difficult to work out which is the best way to sort of direct your energy. So I think I can only give you my view on what sort of outcomes we should be sort of striving for. But as I said, I mean, I think there's a multitude of different ways that you can push for change, whether it's sort of by trying to push for greater clarity of information, or trying to empower others to get involved in the debate, or spread awareness and educate yourself, as various other people have mentioned, or through the political process. I guess there's a variety of ways, and you might want to make use of all of them given your extraordinary abilities.
Thanks, Adam. Chris, final word?
I divide the world into three levels, and I think we've just heard all three of them. There's in a sense, a moral imperative to allow people to eat and to sleep in some degree of warmth and comfort, and there's over 1 billion people that are in that situation now. So there's a moral imperative, and Conrad, I'm with you. The capitalist system seems to be looking after that big picture. We seem to have a reasonable amount of muscle at the moment at the national level of pulling the resource back out of resources sector to build the $25,000 a year per person advantage. But where it hits now is local, and you might have heard this term royalties for regions. And there's essentially two things that you can do. You can go to government and look for a share of royalties, a better share of royalties, a more clear share of royalties, and, not all, and you go to the companies who have sustainable development policies and practices that are designed to work with that community. So what I would suggest is that while you're sitting behind the locked gate, you very carefully plot and talk to one another about when the gate opens, what advantages you are going to seek from the government and from those companies when that conversation restarts. Because if it's only a defence battle line with guns at dawn, and then finally that's resolved, and let's say it's resolved in the direction of the big companies and the government, for example, and you're left with no plan behind that, then I actually think you've let the community down. So what's plan B while the gate's locked with respect to royalties for regions and respect to the sustainable development policies of those companies?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm terribly sorry for the disruption there at the end. New venue, we weren't aware of that issue. We are out of time, very much so. If you would like to keep the conversation going, there is a discussion thread going up on the Institute's Facebook page tomorrow. Please join in the discussion, keep the conversation going. Please don't forget that we have our Renewables Forum here on the 18th of October, and I think similarly that's going to be a really interesting and challenging kind of discussion. Those of you who are left, two of you might be lucky. We've actually got some Griffith Review Wicked Problems, Exquisite Dilemmas copies taped under 2 seats in the room. So if the people that have left, if there's not one under yours, you might like to check either side. And they're simply little USBs. Could you please thank our panellists? Wally White, Liam Tobin, Michael Conmides, Drew Wagner, Adam Stone, Chris Moran. Very, very generous with their time and their perspectives. We're very grateful to our Brisbane Institute partners, and particularly the State Library of Queensland, who's let us have this venue tonight. Very much grateful to you too. Thanks very much for being committed enough to the issue to turn up and have some discussion, have some thought about it. Thank you very much. Take care going home.